when you first became a parent and you were considering what you were going to do after having the baby, whether that was staying at home or returning to work, how did you envision providing milk for your baby when you were not around? This is something that for so many of my clients and my podcast guests, that is so surprising that for most people, it is not possible to just sit at your desk and type away and get your work done while pumping. And that pumping takes a lot more time and energy than we originally expected. So as you listen to Ashley's personal stories, reflect on your experiences with providing milk for your baby when you were gone, whether that was during quick trips to the grocery store or if you worked full-time outside of the home and needed a way for care providers to provide milk to your baby, because this is a challenge that so many people face. So, welcome to the Milk Making Minutes. I'm your host, Lo Nigrosh. I'm an international board-certified lactation consultant, a doula, and a childbirth educator on a mission to demystify human milk feeding.
My name is Ashley Mooneyham. I am married to my husband, Dave, and we have one daughter who is 2.5 currently. Her name is Nora, and I'm actually halfway pregnant with baby number 2.
Oh,
I guess.
exciting.
Yep, so we have a baby boy on the way.
Oh, amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
I feel like the prep for the second baby, feels a little bit different than for the first. I don't know how that's feeling for you. Maybe we can talk about it
Absolutely.
a little bit as it relates to baby feeding for sure.
Yep. Yeah, it's all about preparing my toddler for that transition and really trying to get all of the big things out of the way as much as possible in terms of potty training and big girl
Mm,
bed transition. But she's such a little caretaker and she's so excited to help with the baby and do the baby bottles. So I'm hoping that'll be a really fun thing for both of us.
yeah, that's awesome. Well, congrats. That's great news.
Thank you.
So I'm going to take you back to long before you had your own child,
Mhm.
back into when you were a child yourself. And I would love to know what exposure you had to baby feeding, both breastfeeding and bottle as a child.
Well, my personal experience, my mom had me when she was a college student. So she was going to courses still, taking exams, and it wasn't easy for her to manage that in breastfeeding. So personally, I
Mm,
was raised on formula, and I'm so glad that formula exists and has improved since I was a child. Um,
yes.
and then watching other babies feed, um, I would say the majority of my exposure was pumped breast milk that I was able to help feed my baby cousins with baby bottles. And most of my family chose to approach it that way or formula. I feel like I
Mm,
very much was the tail end of that generation where formula was touted as, the most convenient all-in-one solution for breastfeeding. And now I think the tides have turned a little bit and people are starting to realize the importance and impact of breastfeeding and start to re-emphasize that as much as possible.
yes, exactly. Yeah. And when you think about your childhood, do you remember ever seeing anybody feed a baby from their body?
That's a really good question. In my childhood, it was rare. I think it would only be the closest of family members. So my aunt. I don't have any siblings myself, so I never watched my mom attempt to breastfeed any babies besides myself, which I don't remember. Um, but my aunt would use a nursing cover and nurse in front of me.
Okay. Um, And then as you were preparing to have your own child, did you know anybody else who had had babies before you, who were more peers that had breastfed? And what were the messages that you were getting as you were preparing during pregnancy and maybe even in the pre-pregnancy stage?
Yeah, I was one of the first of my friends to get pregnant. A lot of my friends closely followed me, which is fun because we have a little village, which makes all the difference when raising kids. But I did have, one close friend who had children before I did, and she was a milk making machine. So
Mm.
she was an overproducer. So she actually was able to donate gallons and gallons of breast milk. And
Oh,
that's
awesome.
because she was able to nurse and then also pump, and she would kind of do both each pumping session or nursing
Mm.
session. So her body just naturally started to respond to all of that stimulation and really produced a lot of breast milk, which honestly is in itself its own struggle. But she had a really positive experience in terms of supply being enough for her children and being able to donate that, which is obviously a big blessing.
Yeah, great. Okay, so did you go into pregnancy and birth feeling hopeful about breastfeeding or feeling more like it was going to be a difficult struggle?
Yeah, I would say based on my mom's experience and not being able to breastfeed, I made an assumption that I would also struggle. I think
Mm.
just through lineage associations, I assumed that if my mom struggled, I would struggle to produce enough for my baby. So it's not that I was pessimistic, but I was trying to prepare myself for the fact that I may not be able to breastfeed and that that's okay because I was formula fed and I turned out all right. But certainly I wanted to breastfeed. Like I said, I think it's become so much more common knowledge how impactful breast milk nutrition can be on infants in terms of their development, their health, mother's health. It's something that I certainly wanted to do. And I was really lucky. My baby was overdue by 9 days. And I think in some ways that worked in my favor because she was so mature already when she entered the world that she was, first thing when I brought her to my breast, she had no trouble latching and right away established that connection. And I think from that moment on, I felt very optimistic.
Yeah, that's great. So you are a scientist, and you specialize in microbiology, is that right?
I was part of the microbiology, immunology, and cancer biology PhD
Uh-huh.
program, which is certainly a mouthful.
Yes.
But my discipline was in cancer biology.
Okay.
I studied ovarian cancer.
Okay, amazing. So as a scientist, did you have an inclination to dig into the research related to milk supply and you even mentioned this lineage of difficulty with feeding babies. Were you able to dig into the research and see the difference between maybe systemic barriers to being able to feed our babies successfully and actual biological reasons that people don't produce enough milk?
Actually, I would say I'm a PhD trained scientist, but when I approached my own birth, delivery, and motherhood experience, I wanted to be open to medical professional guidance and not try to influence my own journey too much because PhD science is very different than MD science or IB CLC science. So going into it, I would say I was intentionally pretty naive and open to guidance and advice based on the medical expert community that I was relying on when Nora entered the world. And based on their guidance, I knew that breastfeeding to 6 months of age was kind of the gold standard or ideal if we could achieve it, that it's likely that it would be challenging at first as the breast milk supply regulated, and there might be some pain involved as I learned how to latch her. And I really just dug into less scientific research and more community support in terms of looking for other mothers, looking for lactation consultants, looking for breastfeeding groups and nursing groups on social media to really guide that journey. And I didn't dig into scientific literature until I started having struggles, which only came when I introduced a breast pump.
Okay, so then you have mentioned this first moment having delivered your daughter 9 days past her guest date, as we say, right?
Yeah,
And that the initial latch went very smoothly. So tell me a little bit about how it went from there.
yeah. So actually, not to get so far into the weeds here, but I had quite a traumatic delivery.
Mm.
I was overdue. I was scheduled for an induction on Saturday. a week after I was overdue, and I was actually in labor on induction medication for 59
Mm,
hours, and my uterus was contracting every 5 minutes or less during that time. So by the time they finally made the call to do an emergency C-section, my body was understandably very fatigued from the labor experience, and I ended up having a lot of postpartum hemorrhaging and difficulty during that C-section procedure that caused my postpartum recovery period to be much longer
mm,
than what would averagely be expected. And I only mention that because that did influence my breastfeeding journey in the sense that, as breastfeeding mothers know, especially when your body is getting used to breastfeeding, it can be painful
mm,
and it can stimulate the uterus to contract again, which was not something I was necessarily prepared for and ended up being pretty excruciating for me as
mm,
my body was trying to also heal from that procedure and feed my child. So I remember that being something that I had to overcome in terms of endurance through that healing process, through that change, while also trying to sustain my girl. I was really lucky. My husband was very supportive and at times would wake up in the middle of the night with me and literally hold my child to my breast
mm,
so I wouldn't have to
mm,
even do that holding myself because it became so physically labor intensive for me until I had healed a bit more. So that was one of the earliest challenges that I faced. But like I said, at least I was lucky that I had a baby who very naturally latched to the breast, fed, was motivated to feed, didn't fall asleep at the breast like a lot of my friends have had in these hour-long nursing sessions. So, I always say no journey is perfect. You got to focus on the good and try to get through the bad. And my bad was more my personal healing journey while
mm.
starting to nurse my daughter.
Yeah, I think a lot of people are very surprised by how much that can impact baby feeding
Hmm.
and milk supply is very connected to hormones. And if you're
Yep.
hormonally a little bit out of whack from the postpartum period, or if you've had a stressful birth, or if the postpartum period feels stressful, that definitely
Hmm.
influences your ability to feed your baby. Now, it sounds like for you, milk supply was not a difficulty. However, um, feeding our babies is very physical. And so if we're feeling worn
Yeah.
out, it makes it so much harder.
And I will say, in terms of milk supply, I was not an overproducer or an underproducer. I produced exactly enough for my child, which in and of itself is kind of a stress because there was no way to outsource that. I couldn't get enough milk pumped in order for someone else to take over a bottle feed. I had to be present for my daughter for every single nursing session, or I had to introduce formula, which is something that I was trying to avoid for as long as possible. So definitely, I can relate to the moms that find it very exhausting. I know that that was my experience as well. I think shared feedings are really great if they can be accomplished, but since I was just producing enough, I was certainly grateful for that and decided to just be there for every nursing session for at least those first 2 months.
Wow. Yeah. Yeah. And there are a lot of places culturally where the expectation really is you lay in the bed with your baby for the first
Mm,
40 plus days and you're not doing
yep.
anything else. And that really gives our bodies an opportunity to rest. But that is just not standard practice here in the US. We're expected to be cooking for our families and doing the laundry and
Yeah.
doing the dishes and sweeping and mopping the floor, all the things we used to do while we're recovering from birth. And even in the best of circumstances, our bodies really aren't ready for that.
Yeah. I agree.
Yeah. So you said the big challenge was really when you started pumping.
Yeah, it was. So I had maternity leave for 8 weeks, which, for America is decent. I was grateful for that. Um, but I had to go back to work after 8 weeks. And again, this might be, my own naiveness, but I assumed since I could feed my baby with no problem throughout the day via nursing, that I could just collect the milk that I would have otherwise been feeding her via a breast pump while I was at work and continue to exclusively provide breast milk nutrition to my daughter. And I was really surprised when I used a breast pump, and it took me several pumping sessions throughout the week in order to get enough breast milk to support my daughter for one day
Mm,
away from me.
hmm.
And that was so frustrating for me because I knew I produced enough breast milk for my daughter. I knew I had enough breast milk there. And I was so frustrated that the technology wasn't advanced enough for me to be able to collect that milk from her and forced me to introduce formula earlier than I intended, which again, I'm grateful that there are a lot of formula options today, and I know that, it's a perfectly nutritious way to feed your child. But I think any mom who's used formula knows it's a tough process to find the right formula for your baby, the one that's not going to upset their tummy, especially if they're used to exclusive breast milk. So it was definitely a unexpected hurdle after the journey had been going so smoothly.
Mm, yeah. Did you I know you talked about, in during pregnancy, looking for the right care providers to help you. Was there, a pump savvy IBCLC in your area who was able to do a full phalange fitting and help you work on your settings and all of those things to try to improve your supply a little bit?
I think at that stage, and I'm sure again a lot of moms can relate, pre-birth, you're able to invest so much time in preparing for that baby and so much time on forums and connecting with other moms, connecting with lactation consultants and health providers to really try to make the best game plan possible. But once the baby's in the world, that game plan often goes out the window.
Mm,
And
mhm.
once I was back at work, especially, I was so busy working and being a new mom and juggling that work life balance. I didn't seek additional counsel, I think simply because I didn't have the bandwidth for it. I did do my own Googling and I tried to look up reasons why the breast pump might be so ineffective for me. And I did see guidance on making sure that my flange fit properly. To the best of my knowledge, that did fit properly. I did have a pump that had the kind of stimulation cycle before the suction cycle. So I did everything I could learn quickly to do. But like I said, unfortunately, it was just ineffective for me and it caused me to go back to my roots. That's when I started digging into literature. Has anyone studied this? Has anyone found solutions that actually work for moms? And yeah, that's when I started getting into the literature.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I do, phalange fittings pretty frequently in my practice, and I'm
Hmm.
surprised, um, when people will say, "Oh, yeah, I did a flange fitting," and I see them and there's the vast majority of people, and this is not just from my research, but from, people who I really respect who have done, both official and unofficial studies on this. The vast majority of people that we see who are properly fitted and producing a good amount of milk are anywhere between a size 10 millimeter and a size 17 millimeter phalange. Much,
Oh
much
yeah.
smaller than what most people are, have. And, even I work in a hospital just 2 days a month, just to have that experience on the hospital floor on a busy, teaching hospital. And we don't even carry flange sizes smaller than a 21 at the hospital.
Yeah, I was just about to say, why do you think it is that the standard sizing is so far off from what fits most women? Because I'm certain I was using 21 or 25
Mm,
or something in
yeah,
that range.
yeah. So the thing that I have heard that makes the most sense to me is that when pump companies became more standard, uh, they took a bunch of nipple measurements and then they just went with the biggest size that fit the most amount of people. But at that
Mm,
time, it was not recognized how important a very tightly fitting phalange was. In fact, when I first got into the field of lactation, 8 or 9 years ago now, we used to tell people you should have space between the nipple and the tunnel. And that advice is still standard out there for people who have not updated their understanding of phalange sizing.
Mm.
And I'll give an example of a client I just had this weekend. Her baby was born in July, and she just she just did her dissertation defense last week. So for the last 3
Awesome.
months, she had really been focusing on her dissertation. So she had switched to pumping and bottle feeding during the day. And when she pumped, she was getting about 2.5, 5 ounces at the most in the morning session, and then between 2 and 3 in the other sessions, which is
Hmm.
average. That's about what we expect. But she was using size 24 phalanges. And when you do a phalange fitting, it's not just about measuring the nipple and then, okay, that's your phalange. I always tell people it's part art and it's part science, because you do the
Hmm.
measurement, you select a phalange, but then you try a range that is close to that size. And in one session, I got her down from a 24 to a 13, and she
Wow.
pumped 8 ounces in one session
Wow.
in like a late morning session, not a session that was typically her highest amount of milk. Um,
That's
yeah,
amazing.
so it does make a big difference, phalange sizing.
I think you're right. When I was looking up advice on flange fit, based on the pictures I was seeing, I had the right fit, but I did have space
Mhm.
in my flange fit, and it seemed to be what the internet was advising. But that's so interesting to hear that, that's outdated and new advice says it should be a tight fit, and that could create that dramatic of a difference.
Mhm.
I'm curious what you think about silicone flanges. I've seen a lot of those come out recently, which are supposed to be kind of because they're more malleable, they create kind of more of that tight fit or suction that's supposed to mimic an infant feeding. Have you tried using those and have you noticed any improvements
Yeah,
there?
what we see with the silicone flanges is actually they are less effective.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. And and you know this very well, the mechanism by which
Yeah.
babies extract milk is very, very different than the mechanism
Mm-hmm.
by which pumps extract milk. Just because you soften the phalange does not then
Mm-hmm.
translate to all the things that are happening inside of a baby's mouth, both the positive pressure, the negative pressure, the tongue movement,
Yeah.
the actual mammary tissue compression, which is very
Yeah.
different than just a sucking that happens
Yeah.
with the pump. Yeah.
So the tight fit, what's your theory on why that produces such dramatically better results then?
Um I think what happens is, if I were to guess, so when the tunnel is too big, the areola gets pulled into the tunnel along with the nipple, which causes edema, that swelling of
Mm-hmm.
the tissue. And when there's any swelling, it makes it hard for the milk to actually come out, which is why when people are pumping with wrong phalange sizes, they'll feel milk in their breast. You can feel it there, but it's just
Yeah.
not coming out. And I think it has to do with the
Mm-hmm.
swelling of the tissue that happens right there at the phalange. That would be my guess.
Yeah.
You were pumping at work and you were getting enough, you said, over a few days for one
Yeah.
day for your baby. Tell me a little bit about how you were feeling, both about your pumping experience, about your body, about the pump itself, about work, as all of this was happening.
Yeah. It was very stressful. Every time that I would sit down to pump, I would feel really stressed, really discouraged. I would try a lot of different things, but also be frustrated that I had to try so many different
Mhm.
things. I tried watching videos of my daughter to try to make that connection with nursing while I was using the breast pump. I tried relaxing. I tried warm compresses and hand massage, but it just felt like such a to-do every time that I was using a breast pump, and the results were so unsatisfying at the end of the day. And I think a lot of women can relate to this, but I would spend so long at the pump in hopes that increasing the suction power to that uncomfortable level or spending an extra 10 minutes at the pump would result in something better. But like you said, no matter what I did, there would just be a stopping point for my body in terms of what could be collected. And yeah, it was very discouraging. And uh, it felt like I'm used to being a problem solver, but it felt like a problem I couldn't solve
Mm,
um, with the current technology out there. And that was just, I would say devastating. I know
mhm.
that that's a dramatic word,
No.
but I got really attached to my nursing journey. I really enjoyed nursing. I loved knowing that my daughter was being provided breast milk and she was growing chubby and fat and cute. And it really, really devastated me when I had to introduce formula only because it seemed to cause stomach issues for my daughter until I found the right formula for her, or maybe until she just got used to having a part formula diet. And it felt so unnecessary that my daughter was having to struggle with new tummy aches, new constipation, new worries as a new mom, uh, all because I had to work and provide breast milk remotely and I didn't have the tools to do so effectively.
Yeah, I don't think devastating is too strong of a word to use. We have a biological urge to feed our babies from our bodies.
Yeah.
And I too am very thankful we have other ways to do so in a society where we do not provide enough supports for enough people to
Hmm.
do that exclusively. It is devastating. It's devastating for so many
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. And then I know friends that had children after me, even scarier, the formula shortage that recently
Mm,
happened. It just
right.
really goes to show even things that we depend on or expect can go away. It feels so out of your control. I remember that being a really scary time, and I was lucky to be at the tail end of my breastfeeding journey when that all
Mm,
happened. But just I think more reason recently that people have realized how important it is, if possible, to provide for your baby biologically.
yeah. So did you continue to feed your baby from the breast when you were with her and then supplement when you were not with her?
I did. So my breastfeeding journey in total lasted 10 months, which I'm proud of. Um, but like I said, it had to be balanced with formula, which eventually was the balance that we were able to strike. Um, and I nursed as long as I could. I think hormonally, there was a point in time where breastfeeding, my body was telling me that I needed to stop that journey for myself. And that was a little tough as well because
Mhm,
I was hoping to make it to a year.
mhm,
But ultimately, happy mom, happy baby. You got to make the decisions that are right for your health as well as your baby's health and try to always be balancing that together. So ultimately, I was proud of the 10 months I was able to provide breast milk,
mhm.
and my daughter transitioned away from breast milk no problem.
Yeah, and you said hormonally you were feeling like it was that time. So what was going on in your body that was making you feel like, "Oh, okay, it's we need to make a different decision here?"
Yeah, so my daughter was starting to eat solid foods, and she actually took to solid foods pretty quickly. She really started enjoying eating and she liked eating. So I, I'm not sure what happened because, again, I'm not a professional in this arena, but it felt like my supply was dropping and the hormones associated that were dropping. And then I reached a level that it was almost like 10 months postpartum. That's when I was at my darkest emotionally.
Mhm,
And I didn't make any connections there right off the bat. I stayed in that dark place probably for a month and just couldn't figure out what was wrong because in reality, nothing was wrong. My baby was still wonderful. My marriage was still strong. My work was going well. So I was like, why do I feel like I'm in such a dark place? And again, I think that's where a community of moms or professionals, whatever you lean on as a mother, but you want that village. That's where that really comes in because I know a lot of women at different phases in their postpartum journey, there's just a point in their hormonal rebalancing that really affects them emotionally. And breastfeeding has a huge impact on hormones. And so I just reasoned that something I could try was weaning in order to kind of eliminate that variable and try to get back to some homeostasis there. And yeah, I was able to wean my daughter slowly over the course of a month. I just dropped, I think, like one feeding a week. Because at that point I wasn't doing so many feedings throughout a day. And that was a really smooth transition for us. And ultimately, something stabilized after that journey was final, where it was hard to wean, but once I had weaned, it's almost like I was able to gain back some of my independence and self identity again
Mm,
after that.
mhm. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that story. I think it surprises people when they are in a rhythm and then suddenly something feels off. And
Yeah.
I think it's really important for people to understand that the postpartum period lasts for 2 years, really. You are going through so
Oh,
many
yeah.
transitions hormonally and emotionally, psychologically, that a lot of research indicates that the postpartum period is way longer than we expected.
I fully believe that. I I said a lot because this pregnancy this baby boy I'm currently pregnant with was intentional. It was a pregnancy we were trying for, but I didn't feel ready to try
Mhm.
until my daughter turned 2. And I remember being surprised by that as well. I thought I would want children closer in age, or at least try to have children closer in age, but it felt like it took 2 years to fully heal and find that balance again in terms of my body, also healing from that first pregnancy and feeling confident and strong in my body, as well as my mind, just preparing to start that journey all over again. Um, yeah, I totally concur. I think that took 2 years personally.
Mm.
Um, and there was lots of joy throughout that 2 year period, but when you're really sitting down to think, it's like, "Ah, I don't feel like myself yet. It takes some time."
Yeah, it takes a long time. My kids are almost 10 and 6, and I feel like in just the last couple of years, I've started to feel like
Hmm.
I'm emerging from that postpartum cocoon a little bit. It might take longer for some
Yeah.
people than others, but
And that young
Mm,
child cocoon too,
yes.
because they're depending on you so much throughout those early childhood years. I hear that a lot actually from parents that
Mhm,
once your kids have graduated from 4 to 5, usually is when it's like, oh, the last bit of haze
mhm.
is clearing, you
Right,
know?
yeah, yeah, that's a
So,
good way
yeah,
to put it. You suddenly look around and you're like, "Oh, wow, this is what the world is like."
yeah, right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Are you thinking about this pregnancy and postpartum period any differently than you did the first time around when it comes to thinking about baby feeding or how you'll find the supports you need?
Yeah, actually, I'd love to get your opinion on this. um, so I anticipate that I will need to pump breast milk for this baby again. I do want to breastfeed again and provide breast milk for as long as possible. I want to start by nursing and nurse as much as possible because I really enjoyed that the first time around, and I hope that I have a similar experience when it comes to nursing. But I'm wondering what you think about introducing a breast pump sooner than what I did, because I think part of the mistake that I made was the nursing journey was so enjoyable and so smooth for me that I didn't introduce a breast pump until I had to.
Mm,
And then I was just slapped in the face with reality.
mm,
So I'm wondering the next time around if it'd be smarter for me to introduce that aspect sooner. If nothing else, if it still is a poor experience for me, to get a bit of a head start on collecting extra milk that I can at least stock up and last a bit longer exclusively than I was able to with my first. And I'd also be curious to hear from you, is it common to have similar experiences or more common to have different experiences with your second?
yeah, so I think it would be totally great to start a little bit earlier with the pump. Do you have still the same 8 weeks or a different
Yep.
okay. So, yeah, I would definitely start a little bit earlier, but I would not start right away unless there is a need to
Yeah.
supplement. I think with each baby, there's still a little bit of a learning curve. So once you feel like, "Okay, we've got this," I'm nursing well. It doesn't take a long time to get latched. I'm feeling good about the rhythm. Then you could start introducing a pump session or two a day and see how that feels for you. That's a totally reasonable approach. And then sometimes just
Hmm.
psychologically, you feel better knowing, okay, I have a little milk in the freezer.
Yeah.
Yeah. I would definitely work with somebody to do a full and proper phalange fitting to make sure that you're
Yeah.
really set up for success, and even work with using the settings properly. I know you mentioned like pumping it up, getting it as high as you could, thinking that that might
Yeah.
help. And what we see is anytime there are pain hormones flowing, that interferes with milk
Hmm.
releasing hormones.
Yep.
So,
Makes total sense.
yeah. So I would definitely do that, pretty soon after you're feeling settled. And then as far as experiences go, you see both. Um,
Hmm.
each time you have a new pregnancy, you do have more mammary glands that develop. So sometimes people see an
Hmm.
increase in supply with second babies. The milk often the milk often transitions from colostrum to that fuller feeling of that transitional milk sooner with second babies.
Hmm.
The cells already know what they're doing, so they're able to kind of be
Yeah.
reactivated more quickly. And as far as pumping experiences go, I think it's hard to separate it because I think the learning curve is not as steep with pumping the second time around, and people understand what their challenges were a little bit more the first time around. And so it's hard to know if it's just that people know what they're doing a little bit more, or if there actually is a difference in the pumping. But I do
Hmm.
find that uh, it's kind of variable from person to person. And, different people do respond to pumps differently, but we know that getting your settings and your phalanges correctly can make a huge impact.
Hmm. Yeah, I definitely will be doing that. Let me know if you're available in May
Yeah,
also.
yeah, I would love to. That'd be great. I remember so clearly when I went back to work with my first child, who's now 10 years old, not having a stash and realizing very quickly that he needed more milk than I was producing with the breast pump. Now, I know a lot more now than I knew then about pumping. I would do things very differently if I had it to do over again, but I don't. So I can relate to this story that Ashley is telling so personally. If you are pregnant and you would like to make things as easy as possible when you start wanting to have some extra milk around for your baby, whether because you have to or because you want to, head over to my website, www.quabandbirthservices.com, to feel so much better about pumping milk for your baby.